Welcome to the Life Stuff 101 podcast, dedicated to sharing stories and insights to inspire you to always make your mental and emotional wellness a top priority. We talk to people who share their personal journeys and experiences, as well as to people who share their professional expertise. And there'll also be other times when we share personal tips and stories, which will hopefully somehow spark that aha moment for you too. Because we all have those moments when we think, I wish I had known that earlier in life. That's what Life Stuff 101 is all about. Our discussion today is for general information purposes and not meant to be specific advice. For personalized support and specific answers to questions you may have, please consult the appropriate medical or mental health care professional. Now here's your host who's on this wild adventure ride of life just like you. And yes, a real life person who's actually slipped on a banana peel along the way. Mental wellness coach and psychotherapist Mio Yokoi.
Welcome to another episode of Life Stuff 101. Before our episode today, I just want to give you a quick Life Stuff update of my own. For this week and for the next 2 weeks, there won't be any snackable episodes. I'm currently traveling for a couple of weeks, and I'm not currently at a place yet with this podcast where I'm organized enough to have had a few episodes completed ahead of time. So this is still a learning process for me, and you might notice that the audio quality of these intros may be a little bit different. But do expect full-length Life Stuff episodes coming your way on Tuesdays. Today, we'll be chatting with Mark Freeman, author of You Are Not a Rock, mental health advocate, coach, podcaster, and speaker. Mark was so incredibly generous with his time with me that you'll be hearing our conversation in 2 parts. Mark talks about what his initial concerns were that had him seek out mental health support, the process it took him to get the help that was finally beneficial for him, and we discuss the complexities individuals can face when looking for support. And we use food and restaurant analogies, which are my favorite kinds of analogies. The one thing I want to be sure to mention is that Mark and I discuss our individual experiences of seeking out mental health support in Canada. Mark initially through the counselling service provided by the university he was attending in British Columbia, and for me, I went through finding support from a therapist in private practice in Ontario. In future episodes, my goal is to speak to many people from different parts of the world about what their experiences have been finding mental health support, and also from those who provide it, so that we can maybe have a better understanding of how best to navigate these systems wherever we are in the world. So, without further ado, please enjoy part 1 of my great conversation with Mark Freeman. But Mark, I'm so excited to be speaking with you today because your body of work and your mission to talk more openly about mental health is one that I'm just beginning to do in my own way. But you've been out there and doing this work for so long, and I'm really thankful to your dedication and commitment to this work. And I really can't wait to speak to you more about your experiences and insights. And just as we're beginning, I sometimes feel that discussions around mental health can too consistently take a very serious tone. Mm-hmm. And I think, while there are often times it's absolutely necessary that we do so, I also believe that having fun is an important factor for overall wellness. And so with that in mind, Mark, can you share a fun fact to start us off today?
Oh, sure. And I totally agree with that. I think something like it's definitely true in my own work that I've found it so useful to make jokes about mental health stuff, even the most serious stuff. So I'm totally on board with that. And I think a fun fact, what I was actually thinking about today was that the fun fact is that I crossed the Atlantic by ship.
Wow.
And I feel like, because now we usually just take airplanes across oceans. But once I was on a trip where I was traveling around the world by land and sea, and so I crossed the Atlantic by ship. I highly recommend it to everybody. If you get a chance to cross the ocean by ship, you can just hop on a freighter.
Wow.
And not just hop on it and hide. Like you still pay, but
right.
They have...
Not a stowaway.
Yeah, it wasn't a stowaway. I didn't just hop on it. I should describe that. I paid a person who booked me a cabin, because most freighters have kind of cabins that basically sit empty, and it's fantastic. It's so beautiful to be out in the middle of the ocean and just be surrounded by ocean. and you really get a feel for the size of the planet, and how small it is.
Yeah. Wow, that's really amazing. Can you maybe give us a little bit more of an insight about how that came to be for you?
That you know what it was? I was working in, I guess I was in Korea at the time. I was working in Korea. I'd been doing a bunch of traveling as part of work, and I just really noticed how much pollution there was around airports, because you kind of see it. Particularly, I remember it in particular flying into Narita Airport in Japan. So it's close to the water, and you really notice it. Like, you hit this wall of pollution because you're coming across the ocean, and then boom, you hit this wall. And so that got me looking into like just how much pollution is created by planes and stuff in general. And then at the time I was like, I didn't need to be anywhere. So I figured, oh, if I don't need to be anywhere, I don't need to fly. And so I'm going to explore other ways of traveling. And that's what led me to taking eventually a ship across the Atlantic.
Wow.
And it's great.
Yeah, and I love that the observing of you noticing and not just thinking about something, but then turning that into action. And then as a result, having these experiences and adventures and epiphanies, I guess, to some degree as a result. That's amazing.
It was great. It was great to do it, in part because the world really is quite small. And it sounds, at first it can sound really long, like if you're taking like a 6-day train trip or something like that. But it's amazing that you can hop on one train in Beijing and then hop off that train in Moscow. And you know, when you look at the globe and the amount of kind of space you cover, it is kind of a very small world. I think that was the big takeaway from the trip. Man, I feel like when I fly, I don't get that same feeling of the distance traveled.
It just feels like you're in a really like tight container. and you're just having like this shared experience with these other people in this tight container, and you're flying through space and time, but that's not necessarily, you know, like that's the idea. You understand that that's the concept of it, but in terms of experientially, it just feels like you're just in this like little capsule or something like that.
Absolutely. And which I think this is a great way to bring it back around to mental health, because I find so many people get very, very worried about being trapped in that metal tube that's somehow suspended 30,000 feet above the planet. And it's is an understandably, particularly when we want to control things, and suddenly, you know, we don't have control when we're in that tube, flying somehow over the planet. And then airlines are always trying to like convince you that it's a luxury experience. I think they should just embrace it. They should just really, no, we're not gonna make the flight attendants dress up anymore. We are not gonna, you know, pretend like serving you cheap champagne is a luxury experience. We're just gonna be honest. We're strapping you into a tube. If somebody wants sedatives, we'll make those available. But otherwise, you're in a tube. You're lucky if you land. And that'll be the new advertising slogan. Fly on our planes. You'll probably land. That's going to be my take. I'm going to start my own airline.
Yeah. There's probably some airlines that could definitely use your expertise on that.
Yeah, stop trying to be like marketing. A luxury product.
Yeah.
Nobody's paying luxury prices to sit in a cramped metal tube.
Oh, for sure.
No.
And, you know, that fun fact that you shared with us, I think that was so amazing. But I was actually hoping that maybe you'd also share details about, this is what I came across while I was learning a bit about you, that you have maybe aspirations of writing an epic cyborg pirate romance novel series.
Someday, absolutely. I always change the description of that. So it's great that you read that out, because I would forget whatever the last thing I described it as. And basically, you know what that comes back to is that actually, even when I first got into posting stuff about mental health online, I really thought it was going to be a short-term gig, because and part of this was just I was totally naive about mental health. I knew nothing about it. And so after getting over a bunch of mental illnesses, I was like, oh, like I didn't know you could get over like mental illness. I didn't know you could recover. I didn't know, all these things that used to happen in my head, that those didn't have to happen, that there was other things I could do in my head. So I was like, oh, I guess people just don't know about this stuff. So I'm just going to share it online, because maybe it's like a knowledge translation issue. But once I share it online, then it's done. Like, oh, okay, everybody knows then that recovery is a thing, and I'll be done, and I'll go back to like doing other stuff like writing cyborg pirate romance novels. But that didn't happen. I had to keep making videos. And so this has just delayed me getting on with my real career, which is my cyborg. Like I'm gonna really write just for the cyborg audience too. So that's probably very small at this point. But based on how totally, and based on how Amazon had their categories and so forth, I definitely wouldn't be surprised if there is a category for epic cyborg pirate romances. Yeah. But you could definitely be the person in the forefront of that. Yeah, it's really about market creation. I'm gonna corner the market and create it. Yeah, and I love it. But yeah, that's only. I mean, I've only not been able to get started on that because we. I guess unsurprisingly, we didn't solve mental health challenges overnight. So they're still there. And so I'm still making content online about mental health. So I feel like, with that, there's a number of ways to go, but perhaps maybe you could, if you don't mind, like sharing, like you had mentioned that you'd had multiple diagnoses in relation to your mental health in the past. Would you be open to maybe getting into more details about that? Sure. And I think in part it's just how, and now I see this is quite common, because we go into therapy or we go into whatever it is that we're going to get help. And, I, like many people do, just presented the thing that was troubling me the most. And that then can lead to a diagnosis around that thing that's troubling us the most, or in my case, that was troubling me at the time the most. So I started out with addiction and depression. And later I got help for obsessive compulsive disorder. And later picked up the generalized anxiety disorder diagnosis. And that helped shape my approach to mental health, because it was so useful to see that the skills I was learning were basically the same for dealing with whatever unwanted experience was coming up in my head. But depending on how I interacted with the system, the label I came in with was quite transformative in terms of what I would be offered. And so that did make me kind of skeptical of those labels. And so and now I find they're useful if they're useful. But I always describe it, it's kind of like if we got caught up in trying to label and diagnose how people drown. We're like, ooh, well, you drowned in a lake, so you have lake drowning disorder. And you over here, you drowned in a pond, so you have a pond drowning disorder. And then this person over here, they can't swim in rivers or lakes. So that sounds like lake drowning disorder with a comorbid river drowning disorder. And then this person over here, they have a phobia of Speedos. And that phobia is interfering with them doing treatment for their disorders. So we're going to, throw that phobia aversion disorder on them. And so we can pick up all these labels for how and where we struggle. But in terms of learning how to swim, I mean, there are some variations depending on, what you want to do with your swimming skills, but swimming is the same. And so it really helped me to focus on that. So no matter what diagnosis I was going to get stuck with, it was about learning how to swim with the stuff in my head. So learning how to build better mental health, not learning how to manage mental illness. Yeah. Was the big shift. For sure. And I wonder, I don't know if it's something that you can conceptualize, but I also think about labels as something that could be so limiting, and particularly in mental health. But a lot of people are either looking for, like, tell me what I can call, or what
how I could describe or to give a name to what I'm feeling or what I'm experiencing. And that sometimes having that label, there is like an over-identification, I think, that folks can have, and then that can happen within themselves, but that can also happen in larger cultural context as well, right? It's like, I have depression, or I'm an anxious person, or whatever it is. But I'm curious to know because it sounds to me like you were able to take those labels and to think about them in a different way for yourself. Do you have a sense of how you were able to do that for yourself, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think so. The big help, and this is so it'd be interesting what you've seen in your work as a therapist, because I would say the big help for me was that I completely lacked any insight whatsoever. So when I was doing things like I'd stand in front of my stove and watch it. I was convinced people were trying to poison me, and I'd go through all these elaborate rituals because I was being watched. So I would, if I don't know, put my wallet away and the curtains weren't closed, well, then I was like, oh, well, now the people watching me know where my wallet is, so I have to go through, like, kind of pretend. I was often acting in my own home because of how I thought I was being watched. All sorts of things like that. Tons of like hand washing compulsions, all sorts of weird compulsions, the works. No insight whatsoever that there was any issue with those. So when I went in to get help, I was like, oh, I'm just like kind of miserable, and I think I have some addiction issues. And that was really helpful then, I think, for moving past the label, because I never identified as somebody who was struggling with their mental health really at all. And there was always in focus, and really even going to get help was because I had started to realize I couldn't do some of the things I wanted to do. And I was only going to get help to try to get back to doing the things I wanted to do. And I never went searching online on mental health forums. I never looked up any diagnoses or anything like that. And so in some ways, yeah, it's funny. I do a lot of the work I do now to share about mental health because I would never have looked up any of that stuff.
Right.
But I don't know. Yeah, it's because I know when we look in research now and things like that, how we identify with labels can be kind of predictive of success with recovery, or how well things go there. For me, it was a lack of insight. I don't know. Is there anything that you've seen that is useful for people not getting too conflated with the label?
Yeah, I mean, that it's a very layered and complicated and question. I feel like it's very dependent on the individual. Mm-hmm. And I think also their cultural and familial, beliefs around mental health, I think has a lot to do with it. So I think if there is a strong sense that folks have of, it's like, no, there is, like, I'm generally fine, and sometimes I struggle with something, mm-hmm. Then it's almost like to have a pretty solid like sense of self to begin with. If that's where an individual is coming from, I feel as though like a label or a diagnosis isn't something that there might not necessarily be an over-identification with. But if an individual is coming in with already some questions about themselves or an uncertainty, right, that if given this label or given this is like, this is what you are, or this is, I think about them as tendencies and stuff like that. But, in a lot of different ways, like how we talk about mental health and especially around diagnosis is like, it feels like it's presented in a way that it's like, this is who you are, and then there are some, I think, individuals who are more susceptible to going, oh yeah, that is who I am. And I think it's really difficult to be able to bridge that gap, I feel like, between it's like, oh, this is just a challenge that I have, or this is just a tendency that I have. And I think it runs a spectrum between, oh, this is a challenge versus an illness when it comes to mental health. But it's I think it's quite tough.
Yeah, I can see, because that coming in with that sense of self must be so supportive, because it often probably is, looking back, like one of the first times, especially depending on how young the person is, it could be the first time someone's ever been told this is something you are. We just don't normally get that kind of feedback. But then when you think about how much I think about things like online dating, and I always find it funny when people put things like personality test results. That sometimes, people like, oh no, like I did a test and it says I'm this.
Yeah.
And that desire to latch on to, oh, here is a thing that defines who I am. And if we're predisposed to, we have a tendency to look for that, then of course, somebody telling you, hey, based on this, you're this. It's, I think, very easy to pick that up.
Mm-hmm.
And even then when the brain does it, I think that's always one of the challenges too. Right? If the brain is telling you, oh, you're this, you're not good enough, I'd say you don't deserve that, all sorts of things like that. If we're accustomed to listening to that stuff, it's very difficult to stop.
Mm-hmm. But I think it is fascinating that in your case, though, what you mentioned, what led you to seeking help was that there was some, I guess, understanding of there are things that I want to do, or there are things that I have been able to do in the past, and I'm noticing that I don't have access to those things, or I don't know how to move forward or something like that. Is that what happened for you?
Yeah, definitely. And I think of it like a gap, like starting to notice, oh, there's this big gap between kind of where I am and what I'm doing and who I'm acting as right now, and what's very difficult, and kind of where I know I want to be. And so, it was being an awareness of that gap and a desire to close it was very much what led to me searching for help, and really led to me doing the really difficult exercises in therapy, because it was incredibly difficult to start to make changes, cut out compulsions, interact with emotions like anxiety differently. Like, it was many of them, the most terrifying things I'd ever experienced. But it was having that focus on, oh, like I'm gonna do this, because if I don't do it, I don't get to do the things I want to do.
And when you did seek out help, what is the help that you sought specifically?
You know what? The first time I reached out, I just went to, I was starting a grad program, was doing a master's degree in university, and the first person I went to was just kind of like the counselor they made available through the student health services. And through that, I ended up going to see a psychologist. That was a very bad experience. I went back to the counselor. I was like, don't ever send anybody there again. And at that point, and then I'd run out of the money too. That was in the student health plan. They gave us something like $500 for therapy. Oh. And so then that was gone. And then, and I had already started to pay some of my own money into it. And then, so I went back to the counselor. I was like, look, the money for insurance is gone. Like, what else is there? And through that, I ended up getting into a research program that was being covered through I was in Vancouver at that time, through one of the hospitals. So they were actually doing it through their outpatient program. They had gotten some funding to do this research study on exposure and response prevention, focused on obsessive compulsive disorder. And you had to apply, like it was a whole process just to get into the research study, but I got in. And then that was covered through the provincial healthcare program, and so it was free. And unfortunately, the funding got pulled while I was in the program, but they had a student continue to meet with me, so the psychologist couldn't meet anymore. But they had a student, and at that point, it was already pretty well along. Like I'd already learned how to cut out compulsions and things like that. But I'm totally only a functioning member of society because I had access to that. So it's unfortunate, the funding got pulled. But that kind of, and really cutting edge, it was very, I don't describe it. It was contemporary. They were exploring new techniques, and it was extremely effective and useful.
Yeah. I'm just going to go back to what you had actually shared a little bit earlier as you were just speaking, because I think that sometimes what I'm curious about are the gaps, specifically when you had mentioned when you first had seen the counselor in university, there was something in that counseling, it sounds like, where there was a recognition or an acknowledgement or some kind of identification that a next step would be helpful, it sounds like. Is it that through the counseling, were you able to unearth or to have an understanding that going to a psychologist would be a good next step for you?
The counseling in that case was really kind of like almost more like a caseworker. So it's really that there wasn't counseling in the sense of we were meeting to kind of do counseling. And it was very much about meeting people and referring them on to where they could get help. And I think, and it's probably happens a lot from what I see in university healthcare centers, they're not necessarily equipped to help people. And a lot of it is, okay, how do we help you find something that's going to be useful? And so that was actually built in. That was the expectation from going in. They explained, we're not going to help you here. We're just gonna explore what's going on to see how we might be able to use somewhere else.
Yes. And I just wanted to ask that because I think that a lot of people don't have the knowledge of what happens, right? Or what to expect based on who they reach out to. And in your case, you were in university and you had access to this counseling program that provided knowledge, or at least, like you were saying, sort of like this case work kind of a model to be able to say, okay, like this is, you're going in with this specific concern and let's figure out for you what your next steps are going to be. And it sounds like in your case, the next steps was to go see this particular psychologist. Is that?
That was what it was. And I think this is where, thinking of personal stories and sharing things online, this is one of the reasons it's so useful is because at no point in those steps was any information shared about, here's a person who had a similar experience to you and this is where they went and this is what was useful. And, I could see somebody coming into a place like that and say you're just offered a menu of personal stories from people. And they just said, look, read through these and see if any of these stories are similar at all in any way to yours. Because then we'll be able to tell you where those people went to get help. And it was but this was like let's just throw spaghetti against the wall and like maybe something will work out. And it's like very expensive spaghetti. For $200 a plate of spaghetti, we'll see if anything works out. And luckily for me it did. But the reality is for most people they don't end up getting access to help.
Well, there's access, but then there's also getting access and then not having a good experience. It sounds, and that's what it sounds like happened for you.
Yeah, and that's it. Yeah, getting effective help, and that's again, like I don't want to miss out on any spaghetti metaphors or anything, because like thinking about restaurants, I always describe the mental health care system as like what restaurants would be like if people were ashamed to talk about going to restaurants. Like they didn't want to post a review for the restaurant because they felt the bad meal was their fault. Or they're like, well, that's just the way it is. That's the best meal I can get. And right now, we don't talk about effectiveness. We don't talk about our experience. And then that just, as an industry, it doesn't lead to us improving the experience or improving effectiveness. And that's really something we have to start to do more of in mental health. It's like, look at like, okay, well, like if it's not working out, like let's change it. Because the reality is right now, if something's not effective, well, that service is still going to have a wait list. Or, it could have a 6-month wait list of people waiting to get into something that's just not effective, but that's their only option. And that's just not a good place to be at. So that's why it's so great, like for people to talk more about, what works, what's useful, what should they expect in therapy and things like that.
And to also know that to continue with your restaurant analogy, to be given a menu, right? That just because something might have been effective and helpful for you doesn't necessarily mean that it's something that's going to be effective and helpful for me, right? That you may wish to choose a fish dish off the menu, whereas I may want to have a vegetable dish or something like that, which is going to work better for me for whatever reason. But that I love that suggestion or that model that you talked about of what if it is that we are able to have access to the kind of healthcare, mental health care, where we go into a system or a place where we're given, like you said, stories, right? Because that's what, as human beings, we gravitate most to, our stories, rather than just a list of symptoms or, a list of, potential problems, or like what, how things are listed in the diagnostic, like DSM or something like that. That it is unfortunate that the system has been created or operates, at least right now, in such a way where it's like, what's your problem? And medically speaking, it's often from a medication-based kind of a treatment, rather than let's sit down and look at all the different ways that it's possible to get support and help, but also through stories, like through like this person, this is what their experience was like, and this is the kind of help, support, treatment that helped this particular person with their story.
Exactly. And that so much of that comes up through stories, because I think then too, we see, even if that person, it's a story of them being hungry, but then it explains like why they were hungry that day and their experience and why they went into that restaurant. And then, yeah, maybe they picked a fish dish, but based on reading their story, you understand, okay, I understand. Oh, like that person grew up by the sea and they,
yeah,
they really
right.
missed, this experience of fishing with their grandparents or something. I understand why they got the fish.
Yes.
And then you say, okay, well, for me, given my context, what's the option that's going to work well for me? And I think when we see the stories, we start to make those decisions. And then too, yeah, the practitioners are able to sit down and say, okay, we know you're hungry and we want to get you, I want to make sure you get a nutritious meal, but what are the things that are going to help you eat that meal? Like, tell me about yourself and where you're coming from and what you need today. And then we find that kind of that mix, that overlap between what that person's looking for and what we can cook for them in the kitchen and kind of what they need just as a human being. And that, yeah, absolutely. That we see that through stories. And when there's things like shame and even just all sorts of rules and people not being authentic and not sharing about their own experiences and all sorts of nervousness around that, then we just don't end up with those stories. And it really affects, the treatment that's available.
Yes. And I think that's the reason why, just in speaking to you, I was gravitating toward the initial experience that you had with a psychologist that didn't help, because I think that's also an important story to tell. That sometimes there could either be the experience of the practitioner or the practitioner themselves, or the fact that maybe there wasn't a good fit or whatever it might have been, that it's important to also talk about the fact that sometimes like seeking help isn't a smooth process.
No, it won't. Yeah, it probably won't be. I mean, it's always, because I always think too, I'm always amazed in the system that there's talk of like things like treatment non-compliant or treatment resistant, and or where people drop out of something and that's seen as a failing on the patient. But change is so difficult. And
Yeah.
I always look at things like physical fitness, like gyms, your average fitness gym, they know that they're going to lose 40% of the people who sign up in January by the time June rolls around. And that we don't label those people as like fitness resistant or like exercise non-compliant. It's just
Right.
it's understand that change is very difficult, and there's all sorts of complex factors in our lives that make it difficult to follow through. And then we see very similar numbers in therapy. Like you're looking at around 40% of people will on average like drop out of a CBT study. And so it's just saying like that it's very difficult to change. And that's natural. And so we don't have to see that. And again, I think it comes back to the labels we stick on ourselves. We don't have to see that as meaning something about us. If we struggle to follow through on 40% of things we do in therapy, that's just human. That's natural, even though it might seem like a very big number.
But just to your point, though, I think the system in and of itself and how it operates today, anyway, it's as though it operates on labels, right? Like you were just saying, when people don't go to the gym, we don't say that they're fitness resistant, or non-compliant. But we do put those labels, or that those labels are used in mental health.
Yeah, and I would say it's a huge, just a huge problem. Like really, in any other industry, we would see that as a design issue. Right? Like again, if you have a restaurant and 40% of the people are leaving without finishing their meals, you're like, wow, what are we doing wrong?
Mm-hmm.
How do we help people stay more? And you're always going to have some people who are going to leave, or some people who are going to give it a bad review. But you really want to make sure that you're looking at it as, oh, like this is our design issue. Like, how do we need to design mental health services better so that more people are able to stick with it? And that's just like gyms need to look at, okay, like how do we create more options so that we're able to get more people in, we're able to help them sustain their practice. And it's really an issue the system needs to take on. And so I think you see a lot of the stigma that's really been built into the mental health system, that like, if somebody runs into a barrier in the system, we will label them as having a problem. And that's not so helpful.
No, for sure. Yeah. Again, just keep going back to this particular point that I seem to be thinking about, is, can you talk a bit more about like what didn't work out with that first experience that you had with the psychologist?
I think they weren't on like a fundamental skill. They weren't good at listening. I remember the reason I ended up leaving is they would just say stuff that was not like just like factually wrong, like from what we'd been talking about. So I don't know if they were having a bad. I think I saw them three times. It was $200 a session. I went 3 times, and I had like $500 in my insurance. So I remember like the last session I had to chip in 100, and then I was like, nope, that is it. And so in a sense they were very bad at listening. Looking back, like now doing what I do, they weren't actually doing what I would consider describe. So I really gravitate towards what I would say is like very solution focused therapy. Like, what do you want to do? How are we going to do it? This was very like, so for me spending that $600, we didn't like, I would say we didn't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was just me talking about stuff, which I personally, especially as somebody who at the time, although I didn't realize it, was just like ruminating a lot. It was kind of like ruminating out loud. So in some ways, looking back, I would say it was just participating in the compulsions that I was wrapped up in. And so that I find is not that useful. And so I'd say, in terms of the approach and in terms of just the psychologist's skills, it's like not listening, saying, I remember each session, they told me about where their degrees were from. And I don't know if they had been told like, oh, you have to establish like credibility or something. I'm sure it must have been something that was trained somewhere along the way, maybe, or it was just their personal insecurity. But that was always one quirk that I found really funny. And so, and that was that.
But there was something in you that realized, okay, that you only had like the certain amount in terms of like a financial allowance of the limitations of I only have $500 and I'm now gone over plus my out of pocket $100, and it wasn't something that was particularly valuable for me. But you didn't stop there. And I think that that's the piece that I think is important to communicate, because there's so many times I think when people do seek help or support and they find that maybe it's not a good fit, and to some of what we've been talking about today, often people go back to a place of like, maybe it's me that is the problem here, because I went to an expert, or I went to the person that's telling me where they got all their degrees, but somehow I don't feel better or I don't feel a difference. And they might just stop because they don't no longer have that allowance anymore, or whatever it is, but you didn't. And I think that that is something that is also an important part of the story to tell, is that it's okay for us to self-advocate, that it's actually not just okay, it's crucial that we do.
Absolutely.
That just because you're given a referral to an expert doesn't necessarily mean that that particular expert is going to be the best fit for you.
Yeah.
And Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to totally agree. Yeah.
But because I think a lot of people find themselves stopping. They'll have an experience and it didn't necessarily work out for them. They'll go, okay, well, clearly I maybe not, I can't be helped.
Yeah.
Or if this expert couldn't help me, then there must be something wrong with me. But it didn't sound like that's what you internalized from the experience.
No, and I do see people doing that like now, and just talking with people online, getting questions and things like that. People will often throw that out, and so I think there is this I don't know how to describe it, like kind of culture around saying, oh, like I tried these things and they didn't work, therefore what do I do next? As though, so I'll often see people say, oh, I tried therapy and it didn't work, what else can I do? I was like, well, again, it's like, actually, it's not that therapy didn't work or like doesn't work. And I think, yeah, we're too quick to say, oh, like I went to a therapist and I didn't get the results I wanted, therefore therapy doesn't work. Which is kind of like, I tried exercise and it doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do I train for the marathon now? Because yeah, running doesn't work. Well, it's like, running works. Maybe the trainer you had wasn't able to equip you with the skills or didn't present them in a way that connects with you or something like that. But I think for me, like looking back, at the time, I can't even remember. I think I only went back to the counselor just to tell them not to send. Like I felt it was like a public service announcement, like posting the Yelp review for the restaurant or something. Like I just wanted them to know they shouldn't send anybody else there. Because I think I was like, well, I think I'm done. Like, because my money, like at least the money is out. Like I probably would have gone and done something else. But in my head, it was like, okay, well that at the moment that part is done. And I think then actually the counselor said, well, there are other things we can look at. And so I think that is so useful because, yeah, when we're deep in the hole, it's very difficult to imagine there's anything outside of the hole. But of course, yeah, anybody listening to this, if you tried therapy, that doesn't mean therapy doesn't work.
Exactly. And I'm really glad that they were able to say to you, there are other options, because it's also possible that you could have gone back to a counselor who just would have been like, well, if that didn't work out, like maybe that's it or whatever it is. Like you never know what kind of a situation that you might be faced with. But so for me, the way that I started my own mental health journey, mental health in seeking out mental health support was as I was in my mid-20s and I was just feeling quite listless and just feeling like I'm not sure what I'm doing and not just kind of empty. And at the time, it's just going back like 15 plus years ago now, but still there were people who just, I think, beginning to, like, practitioners who had websites that talking about their practices and so forth. And there's definitely many more people now. Most people, I think, that are in private practice will have some kind of an online presence. So there is a lot more, I think, to choose from. But at the time that when I started looking for mental health support, a little bit more limited in terms of folks who are putting themselves online saying, I'm here to be able to support you or to help you. And at the time, though, I remember going through, or at least having introductory sessions with 4 or 5 different therapists before finding the person that ultimately was the right fit for me and whom I still work with to this day.
Oh, yeah.
And who's been such a remarkable support. And I mean, and as a result of me working with her, I decided to want to pay it forward and to do this kind of work myself.
Oh, that's great.
So, yeah. So when it's good, it can be really good. But sometimes finding that right fit can take a while. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of my conversation with Mark Freeman as much as I did. Part 2 will be coming your way next Tuesday. In the meantime, please be sure to check out all of what Mark is up to at markfreeman.ca. And on that note, wishing you a lovely day or evening wherever you are in the world, and I'll talk to you again real soon.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Life Stuff 101. If you haven't already, please subscribe so that you'll be among the first to be notified when new episodes are released. Always be sure to check out lifestuff101.com for show notes and to be a member of Mio's Miracle Mob. Because as the wise modern-day philosopher John Bon Jovi once said, miracles happen every day. Change your perception of what a miracle is, and you'll see them all around you.